The Lucchese family was involved in every aspect of New York's economic system.
They were not educated in the academic sense, but they understood business.
Treachery ruled supreme in that family. The treachery that was orchestrated enabled the government to effectively prosecute the leadership of that family.
Not long ago, the question of whether the Mafia existed at all was a valid topic of debate. Many people, including FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, for years denied the very existence of organized crime. And for years, the country's top racketeers were able to elude the justice system. With the exception of post-communist Russia, the U.S. has long led the world with the most pervasive organized criminal presence anywhere. And while the mob flourished under Hoover's hands-off policy, recent decades have seen significant inroads by law enforcement. Some say the Mafia has now come full circle, returning to its roots as a loose association of disparate street gangs. None illustrates this reversal of fortune better than the Lucchese crime family of New York. Named after the second boss of the family, this organized crime dynasty traces its origins back to the streets of New York City early in the 20th century. New York was a port of entry for most of America's European immigrants, and it became the breeding ground for some of organized crime's most notorious members. Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, all came from immigrant families who settled in the Five Points area, a crowded ghetto with a long history of Irish, Jewish, and Italian gang activity. It was here that a diverse bunch of these ethnic gangs coalesced in the early 1930s. 5 large criminal groups or families emerged as a central core of a vast nationwide crime syndicate we generally refer to as the mob. The top gangsters of the Prohibition era also formed a commission consisting of the heads of the 5 families and a few others, and it is here in New York where the commission members still meet in secret, still discuss business, still order hits, and still control the rackets that have made these Mafia bosses filthy rich.
Member of any secret organization?
Yes, I am.
What is the name of it?
Cosa Nostra in Italian.
Cosa Nostra in Italian.
Our thing and our family in English.
In 1963, Joseph Valachi became one of the first members of the Mafia to break omertà, a code of silence, and to reveal the secret rituals and inner workings of the mob. For the first time, the public learned of the 5 Cosa Nostra families and the unique hierarchy of these organizations. At the top is the boss, his underboss, and consiglieri, the Mafia equivalent of president, vice president, and attorney general. Next, the family has a number of capos, who each had a crew made up of soldiers, the lowest-ranking made members, who along with non-made associates usually work at the street level. The name at the top of one of those family charts was Gaetano Lucchese, who had long ago Americanized his first name to Tommy. From then on, his became known as the Lucchese crime family. The gangster organization that would later bear his name was already evolving when young Gaetano Lucchese first arrived in America with his parents in 1905. The Luccheses, who had come from Palermo, Sicily, were among hundreds of thousands of immigrants who came to this country in search of a better life. Instead of streets paved with gold, however, many found themselves on the fringes of society, performing back-breaking work for meager wages.
The Lucchese family, like all the other Italian immigrant families, they were determined that their sons and daughters would make it in the new world. And they would very often say to their sons, I don't want you to be a donkey like me. I want to see you study, you do your homework, you go to school. I don't want to hear there's any problems in school. I don't want to hear that you're a truant. I want you to get an education, and I want you to do better than me.
Early on, though, Lucchese felt the lure of the streets.
Every block in an Italian neighborhood had a social club. And when they walked past the social club, they saw something very different. Guys in suits, beautiful suits, fedoras, Italian handmade shoes, big beautiful cars, women. Kids like Lucchese, they wanted to hang around, because what did they see? They saw the American dream, money, power. Nobody bothered these guys.
When Tommy Lucchese was a teenager, his father disowned the son he was unable to save from the streets.
Lucchese came from a family where he was the only criminal. All the rest of the people in his family were quite straight, ordinary, and for the rest of their days were very sensitive and very ashamed over the fact that they were even related to this guy.
Tommy became roommates with a boyhood friend, Salvatore Lucania, who would later be known as Charles Lucky Luciano, credited as the founder of the syndicate.
His arrest record started when he was 10 years old. He moved out of the neighborhood and he settled in East Harlem and changed his name to Luciano, so as not to shame his family any further.
Along with Lucky Luciano, Tommy Lucchese's rise in the underworld came quickly. He developed a reputation as being a stone-cold killer. By the end of World War I, he was working as Luciano's bodyguard and favorite hitman. Carl Sefakis researched Tommy Lucchese for the Mafia Encyclopedia.
By that time, he was already active with Luciano and the others and Albert Anastasia. Now, Albert Anastasia was considered the worst killer of them all. He was the Lord High Executioner, Murder Incorporated. Luciano always thought Lucchese was a better killer than him. He could trust him more. He was cool. He followed orders.
Really, the modern American Mafia, as we know it, was born up on those streets in the boyhood rumbles of guys like Luciano, Lucchese, and Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese. They all knew each other, and they were all in the same, what was called a borgata. Borgata means like a gang of delinquent boys. East Harlem was a really tough immigrant neighborhood. I mean, it was poor, it was violent, it was squalid, it was crowded. But it also produced Fiorello LaGuardia, and it produced judges, and it produced distinguished businessmen. Why, in an immigrant neighborhood, why do some go into the borgata and some go to college? We don't know.
Lucchese, Luciano, and many of their friends eventually became members of the large gang run by Joe the Boss Masseria, a Sicilian who operated out of the Italian neighborhood of East Harlem. Bootlegging was their main source of illegal profit, made possible by the national ban on the sale of alcohol. While supporters of Prohibition had hoped it would cure America's social problems, in reality, it provided gangsters with the opportunity of a lifetime. Lucky Luciano and his criminal associates worked out an elaborate system to import and distribute alcohol all over the United States. Meyer Lansky masterminded the finances. Tommy Lucchese organized the transportation system. Frank Costello handled the bribery of law enforcement and politicians.
These were guys who were innovative thinkers. They were smart, they were shrewd, they were not educated in the academic sense, but they understood business. They understood markets. They had all the requisite talents to become great businessmen. But for reasons that we don't quite yet understand, they went in another direction.
By the mid-30s, the business of bootlegging had become highly competitive and dangerous, with violent turf wars breaking out all over America. In New York, Joe the Boss found his supremacy threatened by a new Sicilian arrival, the power-hungry Salvatore Maranzano.
Maranzano came over and he tried to purify the mobs that would be all coming from one part of Sicily, and they would knock off everybody else and control everything.
Maranzano trusted only Sicilians from the same hometown as his, Castellamare del Golfo, and the feud between Masseria and Maranzano became known as the Castellamarese War. As the war escalated, the younger Americanized Italians and their Jewish gangster partners plotted to rid themselves of what they called the old Mustache Pete's, whose rivalry they viewed as an obstacle to true wealth.
Lansky summed it up best. He said, look, Chevrolet salesmen don't shoot Ford salesmen, do they? He had made his point. Why are you shooting each other? There's plenty for everybody.
An ambitious and cunning Lucky Luciano pretended to defect to the Maranzano camp. He then lured his old boss, Masseria, to a Coney Island restaurant where Masseria was executed, reportedly by Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, Alfred Anastasia, and Bugsy Siegel. Maranzano claimed victory and called a meeting of all the Italian gangsters, proclaiming himself boss of bosses. He then divided up the business amongst those most loyal to him. This was the beginning of the Mafia crime families as we know them today.
Maranzano formed 5 specific organizations, okay, and he set them up along the lines of a Roman legion. He didn't call them families. He set up just like Roman legions. And they were to control strictly the crime within their very specific organized territories.
But there were those who found fault with the new system.
Luciano and Genovese were under him, but they saw that he was opposed to working with the Jewish mobsters, and if you were in bootleg at the time, you had to be involved with the Jewish gangsters, like the Purple Gang that dominated bringing over liquor through Detroit.
Meanwhile, Maranzano knew he'd have to get rid of the fast-rising Luciano. But Luciano had sent over Tom Galliano and Tommy Lucchese as spies in the Maranzano camp.
Maranzano was no fool. He knew he had to get rid of Luciano and the whole bunch, and Costello and the others. So he was planning to kill them all. However, the 2 spies that he trusted very much was Gagliano and Lucchese.
Lucchese warned Luciano of the plot. The Luciano loyalists then counter-plotted and sent Lucchese to Maranzano's office on the pretense of having urgent business to discuss. Within moments, 4 Jewish gangsters posing as treasury agents burst into the office and lined Maranzano's men up against the wall. Lucchese fingered the victim, and the assassins carried out the hit on Maranzano.
Lucchese ran out, and when the police came, there was nobody there except a dead man. And that cleared the way for the American Mafia to be established.
With great criminal vision, Luciano, together with his Jewish mobster partner Meyer Lansky, established a national syndicate of organized crime and a commission to act as governing body. In New York, the 5 families set up by Maranzano were reorganized, and Tom Galliano was given leadership of one of them, with Tommy Lucchese as underboss. After Galliano died from natural causes, Lucchese took command and led the family to its most prosperous and peaceful era. Though his main occupation was mob boss, Lucchese kept a low profile and maintained a front in the garment business to camouflage his criminal activity.
He controlled one of the big dress companies there, and at the same time shook down all the others. They were taking like 30, 40 grand a year for you to stay in business.
The real money, of course, was in the rackets Lucchese had come to learn so well. Along with loan sharking, the Lucchese family ran another traditional big moneymaker, gambling. It was a time-honored business for gangsters, Italian, Jewish, or other.
But Bugsy Siegel would walk down the street, and what first attracted him was gambling. There were gambling games out on the street, crap games. People rolling dice up against a brick wall. And he'd look down and be piles of money laying around, people betting money.
They can set up dice rooms, and it may not sound like much, but when you have 6 dice rooms going 24 hours a day with high rollers, you're taking in thousands and thousands of dollars an hour.
The mob didn't always agree on business. One of the rackets that caused the greatest dissent was heroin dealing. Tommy Lucchese opposed drug trafficking as it left the family too exposed to scrutiny on the streets. Others, unable to ignore the enormous profits, embraced it. All took their share of the profits from the illegal trade.
Lucchese got his cut, you know. He kept away from it, but he expected his cut.
But organized criminal groups have always made money with such favors as gambling, prostitution, and extortion. It was mostly after Prohibition that the mob began looking for new rackets to exploit. Tommy Lucchese's outfit was particularly adept at coming up with lucrative new schemes to bring in piles of cash.
They were involved primarily in crimes such as murder, loan sharking, gambling, labor racketeering, obstruction of justice, political corruption. You name it, the Lucchese family was involved in every aspect of New York's economic system.
Lucchese learned that the secret to a successful industry racket is to seize control of a key union, then put the squeeze on the business owners. This tactic was especially effective in the garment and construction trades.
In the case of the garment center, organized crime, the Lucchese family specifically discovered that there is one key to trucking. That's Teamsters Union. There is one Teamsters Union local which represents virtually all the truck drivers in the garment center. Now, if you take control of that local, as they did, now you've got power. Why is it power? Because if the Teamsters Union suddenly goes on strike, nothing moves.
The same was true in construction. As an assistant U.S. attorney, Michael Chertoff learned how the mob operated.
They had the ability through the labor unions to stop a job, to delay a job, to make sure that the concrete was delivered in a manner that would be disruptive to the progress of the job. And they knew that by creating these kinds of problems, they could cost the companies millions of dollars.
Now, we're talking here about hundreds of millions of dollars. We're talking about four families primarily: the Colombo family, the Genovese family, the Gambino family, and the Lucchese family. But the bosses of these four families had 6 general contractors, 6 construction companies that only these companies were allowed to bid on major projects in New York City. For every job that was over $2 million, the contractor that got the contract had to kick back to the families 2%.
The Lucchese leaders took the construction racket a step further than the other families.
The Lucchese family had one little specialty that everybody had overlooked, but they found it. They realized something, which is that if you're making construction-grade concrete, you need stone. Now, it turns out, they discovered, that almost all the stone comes from quarries in Connecticut. Well, they ship it by water, and it comes into Long Island. But there's only one port in Long Island that handles it and then processes it for construction purposes. Perfect scenario. They got control of the stone business.
The Luccheses lent new meaning to the old saying, one man's trash is another man's treasure. They gained control of the carting industry and hauled in millions.
The World Trade Center at one point, their garbage bill was $1.1 million a year. That's a lot of garbage, but not $1 million worth of garbage. What could the World Trade Center do? They found out there was only one garbage hauler which would pick up their garbage.
Some business owners rebelled against the mob, but found themselves fighting a dangerous battle.
There was always the threat of violence. You know, we had tapes where mobsters would sit with contractors and tell them stories about people who had disappeared or people who had gotten beaten. And all this was designed to send the message that it could happen to you.
So let me get this straight. You guys want me to go with your carting company, even though it'll cost me 3 times as much as I was paying at my old location?
That would be the smart thing to do.
What if I say no? What if I don't want to use you guys? You can't force it. Hey, it's a free country, pal.
We ain't gonna make you do nothing you don't want to do.
That's right. This is a business decision that you gotta make. You familiar with Alden Supply Company? Yeah, they're across the street. That's right, Ken Strauss, the owner. What's he been missing for about a month now? One day he just didn't come home from work.
The problem was that Kenny made some bad business decisions.
They divvied up private businesses such as the carting business or concrete business for themselves. They ran their businesses contrary to the American way. They ran it their way. They enforced their control over businesses and industries through fear.
For over 3 decades, Tommy Lucchese ran his criminal empire to great success without getting knocked off or imprisoned. He also successfully kept his personal family well insulated from his Mafia family. He died of natural causes, and after his death, his surviving relatives actually changed the spelling on his tombstone to keep outsiders away. Before he died, Lucchese had one last bit of underworld business to tend to, picking a successor to run the organization. His choice, with approval by the commission, was a protege from the old neighborhood in East Harlem, Anthony Corallo. Even more than his predecessor and mentor, Anthony Corallo's background was pure hoodlum, as former prosecutor Ronald Goldstock learned.
Corallo was an individual who came up through the family, through violence. People understood that. People were afraid of him. He was a person that was respected, and so for him to head the family was not surprising.
There was only one thing standing in the way of a smooth transition of power. Corallo was heading to a prison sentence on a bribery conviction, an unusual event for the mobster nicknamed Tony Ducks for his ability to duck the law.
Corallo was a person who believed in murder as a means of accomplishing their ends. He was an individual who grew up understanding what power meant and physical violence could do, and he practiced that from the time that he began criminal activities through his years as a labor racketeer into controlling the family.
Corallo began his Mafia career in the Lucchese family stronghold, the Garment District. By the 1950s, he was one of the biggest labor racketeers in the country. He and an associate allegedly put into power the most infamous union boss of all time, James Hoffa.
It is a complex area, and a lot of traditional organized crime groups really didn't know how to exploit it. Tony Ducks Corallo, Johnny Diaguardi did. Johnny Dio was the individual who created the paper locals in the Teamsters Union, which enabled Jimmy Hoffa to become the president. Tony Ducks Corallo played a menacing role within the area of labor racketeering.
After the eye-opening testimony of Joseph Valachi, war on the Mafia became a top priority for law enforcement. And yet guys at the top like Corallo felt no fear. The authorities were learning that traditional methods of fighting crime had no long-lasting impact on the mob. For decades, gangsters operated with virtual impunity. On a local level, law enforcement was corrupt from top to bottom. At the national level, a limited war was fought by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, while the FBI, under the rule of J. Edgar Hoover, officially said there was no mob.
For a long time, until he was embarrassed into admitting the existence of organized crime, Mr. Hoover refused to admit even the existence of organized crime.
Various explanations for Hoover's position include persistent rumors of a secret personal life. The mob threatened to expose his lifestyle.
The idea of charging a person with being a member of a Mafia family was unheard of because of the difficulty the government would have in trying to prove that. They didn't have the inside witnesses. They didn't have the tape recordings of discussions between members of the Mafia who would recite the names of the families or the leadership, who they might be, or the positions held by this guy and that guy. That came later.
Hard jail time was the furthest thing from the minds of the wise guys, but that too was about to change. After years of operating independently, local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies began cooperating. Ronald Goldstock headed the New York State Organized Crime Task Force in the 80s.
For a period of time, law enforcement had been fighting a war of attrition. Individuals were arrested and indicted for specific crimes. They may be put in prison. Generally, they were out after a relatively short period of time.
The FBI found it a frustrating experience.
We would find a witness. We would develop evidence about the crime. We would arrest the extortionist, and we put them in jail. No matter how many we arrested, as we like to say, there was always 100 in line to take their place.
One thing law enforcement knew was that often mob-related murders occurred with no witnesses or with witnesses who were themselves mobsters and not likely to speak to the authorities. When a member of a gang was killed, it usually sent a message to the others to keep quiet.
That all changed with the RICO statute and electronic surveillance in 1968 and 1970, and other methods of dealing with problems of organized crime where you could look at them as groups of individuals committing patterns of criminal activity.
Greg O'Connell and other prosecutors recognized the importance of the RICO statute.
The racketeering statute was a brilliant invention which enabled the government to charge not just a specific isolated offense of larceny or an arson or a payoff or a bribe or a murder in isolation, which is the way the country operated up until that time. What this offense allowed was the prosecution of an actual organization.
You really can't catch the leaders of organized crime on the streets. That's not where they are. Where they are is in social clubs or in restaurants, planning the activities that the soldiers and the captains are going to carry out.
We would plant mics in clubs, in bars, in restaurants, in homes, in different rooms. We would bug telephones, all by court order.
One of the things we were looking to do was to use the RICO statute to indict the commission, the heads of the 5 New York crime families. The Organized Crime Task Force had extraordinary information as to the Lucchese family and some evidence as to the heads of 1 or 2 others. The FBI had bugs in on the heads of 3 families at the time. And so if you combine the 2, there was a mountain of evidence that could be used to indict and convict all of the family bosses.
The New York City Police Department and the FBI began working together with a common goal. Rich Sita was a New York detective on mob duty.
At this point, a marriage was made, if you will, between the FBI and the New York City Police Department Organized Crime Investigation Division, where a commitment of detectives were assigned to FBI squads. And those squads were dedicated to investigations, proactive investigations into organized crime families in the New York City area.
I personally don't believe we could have done the job that we did without the help and assistance of the New York City Police Department. They had an ability to do things from their days on the street as cops and their experience that we could not do. We as agents could not do. We complemented each other beautifully, and it couldn't have been a better match. And without them, as I say, we would have never succeeded as well as we did.
One of the most significant achievements of the joint effort was the planting of a bug in the Jaguar belonging to Lucchese capo Sal Avellino. Investigators learned that Tony Ducks routinely rode with Avellino to discuss Mafia business.
Why we only got 150 trucks running when we used to have 300 trucks running, so.
They got half of that on the other side, Tony. I mean, come on, we're doing the best we can. Busting my chops here.
Yeah, well, this is our bread and butter, you know that. I want to keep it that way.
Yeah, I understand.
This is the business that brings in most of the money.
They knew the car would be the key to their investigation. But planting a bug in the mobile Lucchese headquarters was not going to be easy. The car was constantly garaged at Sal Avellino's home. When parked away from home, it was never left unattended. And when being driven, Avellino drove deliberately circuitous routes to throw off any would-be tails. Members of the task force waited for the right moment. Meanwhile, the team practiced the bugging procedure, working with an identical car and hoping for a break.
In under 15. Ready? Go!
That opportunity presented itself one rainy March night when Avellino drove to a catering hall in Long Island for a garbage industry function. Avellino turned the Jaguar over to two of his hoods, whose job it was to stand watch over the car while their boss was inside. Meanwhile, the team of bugging experts were watching from the far end of the parking lot. With rain pouring down on them, the two guards finally decided it was safe to leave the car briefly and ducked inside the hall. Well, that's when the task force men made their move. They scaled the fence and dashed towards Avellino's car. In one motion, they opened the door and went to work on the dashboard, while one of the team kept watch with a walkie-talkie in back in case anyone approached the car. Within minutes, they had planted the bug. And just as quickly as they got in, the team exited the car and closed the doors, being careful not to leave any telltale drops of water inside. When Avellino left the catering hall later, his two bodyguards helped him into the car, none of them suspecting even remotely that the Jaguar had been tampered with. Here, Tony Ducks and Avellino can be heard discussing the merits of inducting their sons into the Mafia.
Andy Russo just made his other son, the youngest one. Wait. I guess on the last, recently, I don't know when, I mean, you know, in the last year. Yeah. He made his two sons.
So they'll make him good?
No, not now. I mean, not my thinking right now is no. Might change 5 years from now, 10 years from now, but right now my thinking is no.
The original objective of the investigation was to capture evidence, collect as much evidence about the carting industry. Well, what do you know? They caught conversations of the boss of the Lucchese crime family speaking about a variety of crime family interests, including the concrete case. And those tapes were the foundation for what was later known as the Commission case.
This was the effort by the U.S. Attorney's Office to bring down the heads of all the New York crime families. Michael Chertoff was the lead prosecutor.
What the case did was we essentially proved the activities of the Commission over a 50-year period. We had evidence about the famous 1957 meeting of the bosses in Appalachia, New York. We had evidence of other Commission meetings, and we actually demonstrated members of the Commission engaged in dividing up the proceeds of extortion in the construction industry in the city of Manhattan. Bosses and their lieutenants sitting down and talking about how to cut up the money that they were receiving from concrete companies that were paying off on every contract that they engaged in Manhattan. Basically what the Commission did was divide up every contract involving the pouring of concrete that was over $2 million in value among the four families. The Banana family was cut out of that conspiracy. And every job would result in a payment of 2% of the contract price to the bosses, who would then divide it up among the various families as their share of this extortion operation. We also proved that the Commission had authorized the murder of Carmen Galante, who was the boss of the Banana family in 1979, and we did that in the old-fashioned way. We used fingerprint evidence, we used eyewitness evidence, and we used circumstantial evidence from videotapes and photographs. And with that evidence, the wiretaps, the physical evidence, the fingerprints, we were able to put together a picture of the activities of the Commission really going back to the early 1930s.
When the case ended, the top ranks of the New York Mafia were off to prison. Tony Ducks was sent away for the rest of his life. It was a milestone in the war against organized crime.
All of us who worked on the case knew it was going to be a legendary case. This was the top echelon of the Mafia. For the first time, we were going to prove the existence of a commission, that there was a nationwide syndicate. We were going to prove events that had occurred 30, 40, 50 years ago that one had read about but that had never actually been established in court. We knew that to take down the bosses, who were long viewed as the most secretive and the most hidden and the most powerful members of organized crime, would be a devastating blow. And at the end of the case, when every single defendant was convicted on every single count, I think we felt we'd achieved a victory that was really remarkable.
Subsequent to his conviction, along with other top mobsters, Tony Ducks Corralo was handed a 100-year prison sentence. His 2-decade term as boss of the family was finished. When he turned over the reins of power to Vic Amuzzo, Corralo probably didn't know that he was indirectly contributing to the downfall of his own crime family, and to a certain extent, the entire New York Mafia. Former Assistant U.S. Attorney Greg O'Connell believes the assumption of leadership by Amuzzo and his chief aide Anthony Gaspipe Casso was a major turning point.
I think that once Tony Ducks Corralo picked Vic Amuzzo to run the family, along with Gaspipe, that was the death knell of the Lucchese crime family. It was a reign of terror in the Lucchese crime family, where treachery ruled supreme in that family, and where the treachery that was orchestrated by Amuzzo and Casso enabled the government to effectively prosecute the leadership of that family.
One event that led to trouble for the Lucchese family was when the new family leaders went into a window replacement racket with the Genovese family through a mutual associate, Peter Savino.
What happened was Peter Savino, as a Genovese associate, who was directly associated with a guy named Jerry Papa, who was then a soldier in the Genovese crime family, were looking for a business to enter, not just any business, but some profitable business that they might know something about, and they were experienced in construction. And Peter Savino had met someone who was involved in the window replacement business and thought that might be a lucrative industry for him to enter.
In the 70s, we all experienced the oil shortage and the dramatic rise in pricing in fuel oil and gasoline. And it became readily apparent that it was cost effective to replace windows in your home and in businesses to offset the price of heating. The New York City Housing Authority, if you looked at New York City, the sort of number of housing projects, housing developments that they had a tremendous amount of windows and a tremendous amount of money that they were pouring into heating.
It all came as a part of a program to better insulate the buildings and reduce energy costs. So these many buildings in New York City and elsewhere in the country didn't have thermopane windows. They had windows that had been there for 40 years that let a whole lot of heat out and a whole lot of cold in.
It didn't take the LCN very long to figure out an angle, and the angle was to have selective installers bid rig, get the bid, and then assess them a price of $2 per window for labor piece. If you multiplied the number of housing developments by the number of windows in place that have been replaced, you can see the significance of this windows case.
While Vic Amuzzo and Tony Casso waited for profits to pour in from the window racket, the law began to catch up with them. A murder investigation led authorities to victims buried under Peter Savino's factory.
Upon digging up those bodies, as we were standing there watching this evidence come to us, we realized that we had what we needed to roll and to confront and roll yet another very influential and knowledgeable person in the Genovese family, and that was Peter Savino. And he ran around for 18 months, wired up in a secret undercover investigation against numerous members and captains and an underboss and consiglieres of various crime families, until finally we pulled the plug.
The windows case was successfully prosecuted through a cooperating witness, Peter Savino. He had the inside knowledge, if you will, of the machinations that occurred that allowed this case to proceed. How the bids were rigged, how the payments were extorted and distributed.
When we indicted the windows case, Vic Amuzzo and Anthony Gaspipe Casso, who were then the boss and underboss, the two highest ranking members of the Lucchese crime family, fled. And while they were on the lam, they began a series of contracts on their own leadership, which we later prosecuted Vicamuso for in Gaspipe Castle. And they knocked off captains who they thought might be treacherous. They labeled them as rats and ordered their own soldiers to kill their own. And it happened half a dozen times.
The murderous actions of Gaspipe Castle led authorities to believe he was either insane or just plain stupid.
Stupid to a degree that is almost breathtaking. It is almost inconceivable that in an organization originally founded by a guy who was so low-key, you would never guess this man was a mafia leader, to be replaced ultimately by a psychopath.
Amuso and Caso became increasingly paranoid. They even turned on their own chief executioner, Peter Chiodo, when he failed to carry out a hit. After an attempt was made on his life, Chiodo flipped and became a witness. So did acting underboss, Little Al Diarco. In 1993, Diarco walked into the FBI's office in White Plains, New York, after being falsely labeled a rat. It was an event law enforcement was waiting for in their ongoing war against one of the world's most successful criminal dynasties ever.
This is it. Let's hear it.
Okay. I'm going to tell you what I know, and I'm going to tell you how I know it.
For the Lucchese family, the curtain was closing. Prosecutors were able once again to strip away the top layers of the family leadership.
Vicamuso is still the boss of the Lucchese crime family. And that's what I think the government's view of the situation, based on the evidence, their current understanding, is that he hasn't relinquished control, but he could.
Former FBI agent Bonavolanta believes the Lucchese family is in serious trouble.
The new leaders, the leaders of today, the second and third team, as I have always called them, they're tied not by honor, respect, and family. They're tied by the economy. They're tied by money. They're tied by greed. And greed and money, those ties are much easier to break than honor, respect, and family. So what we're finding is a much less competent mafia leader today, La Cosa Nostra leader today, than we had in the 70s and 80s.
You know, you ever see those charts? You know, the original Neanderthal or the Lucy, wherever it is, the earliest man, they look sort of ape-like. But as the time goes on, they get smarter, their brain cases get bigger, and now they're erect Homo sapiens in business suits. It's the opposite way here.
Though Thomas Dewey promised to rid the country of the mob, and Robert Kennedy made the same promise decades later, it has only been in recent years that new laws and new approaches to fighting organized crime have started to pay off. Federal, state, and local police have finally figured out how to work together effectively. Legislators have at last given prosecutors laws with teeth. The once powerful dynasty that was the Lucchese family has also been affected by cultural changes since the early 1900s. Old world traditions transplanted in the land of opportunity provided just the fertile conditions needed to produce such criminal masterminds as Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Gaetano Lucchese. Later replacements for the founders of the National Crime Syndicate seem to have taken a Darwinian step backward.
If people think the battle is over, if they walk away from the constant need to fight organized crime, then in 10 years or 20 years, organized crime will come back.
Though many have proclaimed the death of the old mob, especially the dynasty once ruled by Tommy Lucchese, law enforcement officers caution that the mafia is down but not out. They remind us of the amazing power of criminal enterprises to regenerate. And while the Lucchese and other crime families may never regain the power of decades past, they continue to operate in the shadows. They are constantly devising new rackets and new ways to elude prosecution. Perhaps the final chapter will unfold as law enforcement further refines its efforts to stay one step ahead of the wise guys. I'm Robert Stack. Thanks for joining.